As the number of us who call this planet home continues to grow, those places we try to call home are actually shrinking. The UK has some of the smallest homes by floor area of anywhere in Europe. In places around the world, it is a necessity due to a housing shortage crisis. But how does that impact on our state of mind and, by extension, our quality of life? When it actually comes to living space, the smaller necessarily have to mean awful. Developers and architects are looking at new ways to solve what's called the housing crisis while providing at the same time a creative and comfortable home. Will their ideas tick all of the right boxes?
Property agents might describe small homes as cosy or quaint. But in cities where space is at a premium, when is compact really a euphemism for cramped, and charming just code for confined? Do housing crises push more of us into shoebox homes? And at what point do the walls start closing in? The UK has some of the smallest homes by floor area in Europe, and they're shrinking. The biggest houses were built in the 1970s at an average of 83 square metres, but they're now smaller still at 67 square metres. The government adopted space standard guidelines in 2015. It recommends 37 square metres for a one-person, one-bedroom flat, and 50 square metres if it's a one-bedroom flat for two. But they're not mandatory, and house builders have warned compulsory standards could make the housing shortage worse. These days, small house living using clever space-saving designs are marketed as aspirational homes. And developers argue micro-studios or mini-apartments are a solution to the urban housing crisis. Property developer The Collective thinks their co-living space in West London is part of the answer. After opening last year, it filled up with young professionals and offers modest rooms with several much larger shared spaces, including a gym, library and cinema. The smallest rooms are 9.2 square metres, including a tiny bathroom and mini kitchen that's used by one other neighbour.
It's fully furnished, so it comes with everything. And then as we walk into the ensuite room itself, you've got a nice spacious room with big window that lets lots of light in. You've got underbed storage.
Shoebox living is a way of life in many large Asian cities. Hong Kong is notorious for its cramped spaces, where subdivided flats and so-called cage or coffin homes are well documented. And as surging prices limit how much a buyer can afford, developers are shrinking spaces so they're within reach.
In the downside, I feel like, oh, come on, I'm back to this box once again. And I have to stay in this box for another 10 or 11 hours.
But Singapore has announced stricter guidelines on the maximum number of apartments in residential buildings to try to reverse the trend towards shoebox units. Efficient cities encourage density to reduce land use and travel commutes, but density can also lead to overcrowding. And smaller spaces have implications for well-being and quality of life. Authors of a 2014 Cambridge University report on living space warned cramped conditions can lead to illnesses like asthma and even depression. In urban areas, space is a commodity. Shoebox proportions can be an affordable answer to housing shortfalls, but at what cost to health and well-being? And are shrinking houses redefining the idea of home?
And I'm very pleased to say that with me in the studio we have Julia Park, the head of housing research at the architectural firm Levitt Bernstein. Julia also wrote the book 100 Years of Housing Space Standards. Nigel Ostime is with me, architect at Hawkins Brown. Sinead Canning too, a property expert. And making up the numbers, James Smith, research director at the Resolution Foundation, a think tank which works to improve the living standards for the less well-off in Britain. Thank you all very much indeed. There's an awful lot to get through here. It's not just about space, it's about health, it's about where we're going as a society. Julia, let me come to you first of all, because I've read out the fact that we have among the least floor space per person in Europe. We used to have the worst. Is it that we're getting better in the UK or other places are shrinking?
I think mostly the other places are shrinking. I think that's a fairly general phenomenon, partly because we're having families, households are smaller, we're having fewer children. That's one of the reasons. So the gap is closed, I think, it's fair to say.
So places like France and Germany, which used to be ahead of us, are now catching up in reverse, if you like.
I think so, but I think where we do still stand out, if that's the right phrase, is that we have small rooms compared with other European countries. We have a particular propensity to bedrooms, it seems. It's a kind of status symbol to have lots of bedrooms, even if they're very, very small, which typically they are.
Housing space standards. I'm not so sure that many people would understand that there was such a subject to be studied. Are we pretty bad at it here in the UK?
Well, we have quite a long history of it, actually, but it's a history of here today and gone tomorrow. Many people will have heard of Parker Morris. He was responsible for the most famous space standards, certainly in England, probably in the world, actually.
Were these the ones that Mrs. Thatcher ditched?
That's right, in the 80s, yeah. But they've come and gone, as I say, and certainly affordable housing has been subject to space standards until fairly recently, and we do actually have a nationally defined space standard now.
Can we get on to that in just a moment? Because this is something
Sure.
that the government has brought in, but isn't necessarily taking up. James, let me come to you. You investigate the way this affects people of lower income, if you like. It's not a matter of houses per se, it's a matter of health, isn't it?
It's a matter of both, to be honest. So the thing that's really striking is just how much more expensive housing has got. So over the past 20 years or so, the price of housing has more than doubled, whereas incomes have just not kept track and increased by less than half that amount. And the people this affects tend to be those most vulnerable in society, so particularly the poorest in society, but also the youngest. So millennials are spending 3 times more on housing than the equivalent generation 40 years before, and they're getting less for their money. They're getting less space. They're having longer commutes. So this is something that affects everyone, but it affects particularly those vulnerable.
This is for everybody here. If a government's only job is to protect the welfare of its citizens, we're being failed, aren't we? Not necessarily us at this table, because I think we're all living in pretty reasonable accommodation. But the people that James is referring to, we're all being let down.
Absolutely. I mean, there is an affordability crisis without a doubt, but I think an awful lot of the difficulties that we're facing at the moment are also to do with housing delivery. And there's been a complete failure to deliver the quantity of housing required over a period of many decades and successive governments. And ultimately, that gap between delivery of housing and available housing has created an affordability crisis that's now almost impossible to see how it can be resolved.
What does it do to your head, do you think, to live in somewhere where you feel that all 4 walls are squeezing in on you?
Well, it can't be a good thing, can it? And I think it's something that, as James is saying, is affecting probably the younger part of our population than it is the older people. And we need to think carefully how we deal with these issues.
And that's what you do to some extent, isn't it? I mean, you're taking a look at perhaps limited space and saying, how can we make it better?
Yes, I think as architects we try to find the best solution for the particular site, and we find it helpful to work with space standards because it gives us a basis to start from. But that really is only a starting point, and what we try and do is find the best way of developing the site.
And are people skimping on standards? I mean, not referring to your firm at the moment, but because cost comes into this and building costs are going up, and they want to get more out of the people who are living in these spaces, and therefore corners will be cut.
Yeah, we talk a lot at the moment about the race to the bottom, that a lot of focus is on price and not about longer term value and the cost of the building in use. And there is certainly an issue. Space standards are one part of a broader issue, which also touch on quality as well. And we've seen a noticeable drop off in quality in housing, which is another issue that we need to address. A piece of work that is being carried out by the 3 principal institutions in the industry at the moment: the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors and Chartered Institute of Building, is looking to address how we measure quality. We measure time and cost pretty well, but we don't measure quality, and space is one factor of that, but there are many other issues.
I think one of the frustrations that I come across in the work that I do on behalf of my clients, who are generally small to medium-sized developers in the private sector, is that the focus seems to be all about the numbers, and as you say, not necessarily on the quality. And a particular frustration of mine would be the focus on square footages, and generally I find that involves crushing the floor-to-ceiling height, which I mean, two of the factors which really influence, I think, how happy and well-adjusted people feel in their own homes are the quality of space and also the amount of light coming in. And ceiling height is something that generally tends to be ignored in favour of number of bedrooms and floor areas, and overall I think produces inferior environments to live in.
Yeah, and this comes out when people are asked what sort of homes they want to live in, and most people would like to live in an older home, even though that probably has poorer energy standards than the new homes, purely because ceiling heights are lower.
Ceiling heights are higher, are they, or lower?
Ceiling heights are lower in new buildings.
Yes,
and higher in old buildings.
So your typical Victorian terraced house would probably have a ceiling height of about 2.8 metres, and the average for a new build is probably about 2.35 metres.
So it's volume as much as space, isn't it?
Yes, and obviously well-being and the environment that you live in has a lot to do with intangible issues like the view out the window, whether or not you can see some greenery. I mean, I'm doing some thought leadership work at the moment on happiness and health in residential buildings, because the focus around well-being, I'm sure you'll agree, has largely been on commercial buildings, and the look at so where there are very obvious bottom line considerations around staff turnover and sick days, you'll find that there's a real emphasis on delivering great air quality and lovely green views and nice spaces to work in. But the same standards, for some reason, don't seem to be applied to our residential homes.
Let's get onto this, because it's something that you mentioned earlier, Julia, to one of our producers. You said there have been advances over the last, let's say, 25, 40 years in technology, in medicine, in travel, in almost everything except in this.
Yeah, almost everything else has got, well, with a bit of debate, has got better over time. Cars, kitchen appliances, there's no comparison with what we had 20, 30 years ago. And most of these industries are competitive industries, as is the housing industry. But in these other fields, that competitive setup doesn't seem to bring things down. It seems to work, and I just don't really understand why housing bucks that trend.
I was going to ask you why, but you don't.
Well, it's really frustrating. I think we've learned that the house builders are not mainly on their own volition going to raise standards willingly. The people who appeal to the mass market, even though, as you said, Sinead, they must know by now that people do value space. They value a bit of more ceiling height. People certainly value daylight. The size of windows is another reason why people tend to choose older housing, and they value character. And all of those things have been eroded, and there's not much sign of improvement.
It seems like how people are responding to this is by chopping up the existing space ever smaller. And what that means is you end up with accommodation where it's just not big enough for anything other than sole person households, and this is a big problem in terms of the housing stock that we actually have.
Yeah.
It's not just having affordable housing, it's having homes that work for the families and allow them to grow and actually live in these places.
Well, and also we can't control how many people ultimately live in a dwelling either, can we? So we might set standards, but how many people end up living there is something that's quite difficult to manage.
I mean, I think you've touched on a really important point. And it is largely to do with the fact that I feel that the development industry generally is quite conservative. And because of the amount of money that's at stake, irrespective really of the size of development, that they tend to go for I wouldn't say the obvious route, I was going to say the lowest common denominator, and I don't think that's necessarily true, but the known quantity, the product that will sell. And unfortunately, the other issue is because of rising land values somewhere like London, which saw a huge increase in a very short space of time. Like I think land values went up about 48% in about 3 years. A lot of the design detail, unfortunately, gets value engineered out at a later stage.
What do you mean by value engineered?
Value engineered
You mean
means
it's just not worth the while?
well, it means that when, you know, generally maybe the planning process has taken a bit longer, the developers had to hold the site for 6 or 9 months that they hadn't budgeted for. In that time, cost of labour and materials have gone up. And so a lot of the nice design details, unfortunately, end up being removed at a later stage because they realise that they're not going to be able to deliver an elaborate cornice or a
Does this answer the
detailed
question that Julia was posing when she suggested that, you know, it was odd that housing standards hadn't improved, but everything else had?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. And of course, the other difficulty is that with regard to housing is the amount of time that it takes from the point of acquisition of site to delivery to market. The market conditions can change completely in that time. So
I was going to ask if there is a bogeyman in this, and if perhaps it is those developers who are hoarding land, because I read about this at least once every 2 or 3 weeks, that massive amounts of land are being bought up by speculators who then
The fact is
wait
that-
for the right time to do it, and in doing so, they're throttling the millennials, the less well-off.
The way that, I mean, fundamentally, I think what we're talking about today is affordable housing in the large part, and we build our affordable housing off the back of private development through a mechanism called the Section 106 agreement. But the trouble is that the house builders only want to build a certain pace. They don't want to build quicker than they can sell, and that inevitably holds up the production of other housing.
Well, it's about holding up price, isn't it? I mean, there's such a shortage, they would sell. It's about keeping up price. I mean, house builders are...
So it's supply and demand. They're holding stuff back because therefore their properties become scarcer, therefore they are more desirable.
I think, you know, developers are unashamedly out to make profit for their shareholders. And they're doing their job well if they return lots of profit. And that's fundamentally problematic when you're delivering housing.
Do say what you're going to say, but aren't we therefore dealing simply with market forces, and how do you control this? That's my next point.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm probably the most private sector oriented person sitting at the table. And a lot of my clients are struggling to sell in the current market conditions in London. So they have finished units and they have not been able to sell them. And obviously that's a really, really expensive...
Are they dropping prices as a result?
They've dropped prices and...
To an affordable level?
Well, indeed, one particular client of mine, all of his units now fall within Help to Buy, and he still can't sell them at the rate that's keeping his bank happy. So, you know, these are very, very difficult situations to be in. I mean, he obviously started
Should we feel sorry for this person?
Well, I don't know that I'd say feel sorry for, but I do think that the debate invariably ends up pointing the fingers at the private sector and finding fault with the delivery of housing. And that's a bit of a government distraction to the fact that actually they stopped local authority building 20, 30 years ago, and that they haven't kept pace. In actual fact, if you look at the delivery of housing over the last 30 years, the private sector always delivered between about 22 and about 27 or 28,000 units a year. That used to be matched by the local authorities, and then when Margaret Thatcher changed her mind about funding for all of that, that stopped. And so that gap of 25 to 30,000 units has continued every year for the last 25 years. And so now we've got a shortage of 500,000 homes in the...
There's a fixation, I think, with selling properties, home ownership here in the UK. And the truth of the matter is, for a lot of people, buying a house is beyond their means. It's a pipe dream for, you know, given the level of incomes, what's happened to living standards and the cost of housing. So for someone the typical person in their late 20s, it now takes nearly 19 years to save up for the average deposit for a house. Back in the early 90s, it was just 3 years, basically, on the same measure. So it's great having more affordable homes to buy, but we should pay more attention to the rental sector as well.
Okay, and what should we be doing with the rental sector?
Well, we should make life for people in the rental sector better. So what's been already said is in terms of the lack of affordable home building, and that's been a big problem. And we've seen the number of vulnerable households who are living in social housing actually fall at a time when the cost of housing is rising and the housing crisis is becoming a more acute problem.
Surely a government has a duty to control this, and I'm seeing no real control over this whatsoever. I mentioned market forces, it's supply and demand. Prices are going to continue to go up, wages aren't going up anything like as fast, the gap becomes bigger. Why is there not a political will to do this? Anybody got a thought on that?
Brexit has sucked the oxygen out of the
But Brexit's only been 2
political
years.
system.
It's gone on much
This has been going on for a long
longer than
time.
that. I think government has failed in particular to house those people who need help with housing, and that's an abdication of responsibility.
It's about building the right sort of housing, isn't it, Julia?
It is about building the right
And one
sort of
thing
housing.
James mentioned earlier, this releasing of the assets that local authorities can now spend on housing, which has been prevented up until recently, and that I think should make some substantial difference to building the right sort of housing, and hopefully to building it at the right pace as well, because the local authorities won't have the same regard to commercial interest at the house building.
See, I don't really understand this. I mean, there are an awful lot of millennials out there who are going to be putting their X's in particular boxes when it comes to elections. And if you said we will provide affordable, and this isn't affordable housing in the official sense, but we will make housing affordable for you people by introducing legislation, they would get an awful lot of votes in the same way that Margaret Thatcher did when she sold off the council houses and gave people sort of mortgage responsibilities, etc. And yet in March of 2015, new technical rules came in. The government said, oh, we're not really that interested in them. Why? Is it not a hot potato?
Well, the government has been making the right noises about this. So Theresa May in her party conference speech highlighted housing as one of the biggest policy issues that's out there. But we, as up to now, we haven't really seen that sort of rhetoric backed up by policy. So it's helpful that local authorities can do more to build affordable homes, but it'd be great if central government can put more money in. I mean, the truth of the matter is there is less money from central government than there was a decade ago, and not enough is being done to address that. And
Okay, what about making landlords have more duties and obligations? The rent capping. You have to provide a certain amount of space.
Absolutely. I mean, you're quite right that lots of people will need to rent for the foreseeable future,
Or for the rest of their lives.
or for the rest of their lives. But that's a very good reason why rent caps should be considered, because these people who are renting are still aspiring to home ownership at some point, and many of them aren't able to save anything because rents are so high, and a lot of private rented accommodation is extraordinarily bad, isn't it? I mean, there was a case in the paper a couple of weeks ago, 35 people living in a semi-detached house.
Because, of course, the danger is...
Where's the morality
you
gone?
cap a rent, then the landlord tries to get more people in to make up the money that this person has lost. So not only do you do rent cap, but you actually institute the living standards that have been put to one side by the government from 2015. It's possible to do it, isn't it?
It is possible to do it. I think that the government has really misunderstood the value of housing standards and the fact that they can be achieved almost for free. That may sound daft, but if you set reasonable standards and you put them into regulation and there is no argument and everyone has to meet them, then that becomes a cost to the developer, which is factored into his viability calculations, the number of homes he can get on the site, and the cost comes out of land value. You don't actually have to pay for it. It takes a little time for that in transition for that to take effect, but that is the truth.
Okay, we don't have very much time, and I know you want to say something about that, but if you're representing the private developer here, if you like, I want to ask you about one thing that you mentioned earlier on, and that was the sense of green space, beautiful views, lovely fresh air when you're talking about commercial spaces. Are developers now becoming aware that making living conditions inside people's homes is as important as it is commercial? Because that's where we started, living conditions.
Living conditions. I don't know that it has enough focus yet. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that point. I mean, we are now the indoor generation. We spend 90% of our time indoors and 65% of that time at home. And I don't
95%
think,
indoors?
90% of our time indoors
Get a dog.
90% of our time indoors, and 65% of that time in our own homes. So I don't think that enough consideration is given to the effect that that has on people, and certainly being made to live in small, dark, pokey spaces with no storage is definitely not good for
But a
anybody's
conversation is
health.
being had, is it?
I think there is some focus coming to this area. The consideration for me should be not just about space standards, but also about quality of design.
And that's what you were saying.
Well, absolutely, it's a key factor. I think we also need to think about the tenure. We were saying that the fact is that people can't afford to buy homes at the moment, and that's not going to change for some substantial time. So we're now seeing, and I'm sure you're the same, Julia, finding an increase in the amount of what we call build to rent. So we're building blocks of flats which are specifically designed for renters, rather than being built for private sale and then putting renters in them. And that's
The conversation will continue. You're all experts in your field. You'll either do it with the cameras go off here or you'll do it elsewhere. Thank you very much indeed. That's all we have time for. And thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. You can catch up with all of our programmes on YouTube, TRT World Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team that put all this together, and from my guests, thank you. Goodbye.